Introduce Tom Kapazinskis, who will carry on the introductions from here. Tom is a member of the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts. He has a practice both in South Bend, Indiana, and in Evanston. He's been a member of our society for about 10 years. Tom?
I thought that I'd start out by doing the necessary, that is, giving you the basic information. Our speaker tonight, Wolfgang Giegerich, is a Jungian analyst who's in private practice in Stuttgart in Germany, and he is a lecturer and a teacher at the Institute there. He is also a person who's lectured at the Aranos conferences in Ascona, Switzerland. He's the editor of Gorgo, a journal for archetypal psychology and imaginal thought. He publishes widely in Spring, Gorgo, and other psychological journals and writings. He's currently at work on a book which I guess will be called The Psychoanalysis of the Nuclear Bomb, and gets us close to the kind of topic that he'll be discussing tonight. I just wanted to add a personal note to this perfunctory aspect of the introduction. I remember first meeting Wolfgang Giegerich roughly 10 years or so ago, and it was in Ascona, Switzerland, at one of the Aranos meetings. And at that time, Wolfgang began to do something which I would imagine he'll continue tonight. At that time, as I recall, he was working on some of the questions that went into many of Erich Neumann's positions that have to do with the origins and history of consciousness, and questions of ontogeny and phylogeny, and the way that Neumann took those questions. And having trained at the Jung Institute in Zurich and for a long time absorbed a kind of perspective that Neumann was the successor to Jung, and that many of his ideas were to be taken as gospel, Wolfgang Giegerich began to be a kind of gadfly who forced all of us who were there at the meeting and in conversation to begin to look again at Neumann, to unpack some of his ideas and to start to see through them in terms of Neumann's assumptions. The point is that he is a man who is a bit of a provocateur, and if provocation makes you a little uncomfortable, you probably could storm to the rear of the auditorium and demand your money back, because I imagine he will provoke you tonight to think more deeply, perhaps more penetratingly, about the questions that surround the nuclear bomb and the potential nuclear holocaust and the underlying assumptions. So if you're prepared for an interesting inquiry that will throw you back on yourself and perhaps help you to unpack some of the issues, then Wolfgang Giegerich is your man. And I think also in the workshop tomorrow, the issues will be further deepened. So it's a true pleasure to present a colleague and friend, Wolfgang Giegerich.
Thank you, Tom. And I would like to thank also the Jung Institute of Chicago for giving me this opportunity to share some of my ideas with you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you look at a medieval painting, such as of the Dutch school, you have to step up to it very closely in order to be able to appreciate it with all its details. Each hair in a fur collar, each blade of grass seems to be painted separately. If, however, you were to stand just as closely in front of the painting of a French impressionist, you would only see spots of paint, but no picture. Every picture thus prescribes to the viewer the distance appropriate to it. This is not only true for paintings, but for all subjects of contemplation, including those of theoretical reflection. For this reason, very much depends on whether we find the correct distance to our theme, the nuclear bomb. For if we step up to it too closely and view it merely within our immediate present, only within the context of today's power blocks and disarmament negotiations, only within the context of our personal fears of survival, then we will only have an essentially reduced view of the bomb. The nuclear bomb threatens life in its entirety, which means that we must find a standpoint that grants it the widest possible horizon within which alone it can unfold its full essence. For whatever has the power to put our world as a whole at stake must be a kind of equivalent of this world in a nutshell, and as such be thoroughly interwoven with and deeply rooted in the history and reality of our Western world at large. As we said, the context of today's survival problems and political questions allows only for a very limited perception of the bomb. Our picture of it would be just as reduced if we were to understand it merely personalistically, as the expression of our repressed aggressions, our hypertrophic patriarchal tradition, our hubris, and our sorcerer's apprentice attitude, to mention just a few of the commonest cliches. The nuclear bomb, in its phenomenology, is so immense and so inhuman that, although a man-made object, it nevertheless extends far beyond the merely human into the dimension of the ontological and theological, into the dimension of being and of the gods. Only on this plane can we hope in some degree to do justice to its dreadfulness. Therefore, I will not attempt to understand the nuclear bomb personalistically and humanistically in terms of an aberration on the part of mankind, but ontologically and theologically in terms of the history of being and the fate of God. This fate of God seems to me to take place in the events that we are told about in the Old Testament story of the worship of the golden calf. This is, so to speak, a story of the collision of two worlds. The one world is situated in the lowlands and is characterized by an animal-shaped image of God cast from metal, to whom the worshipping people bring offerings and in whose honor they celebrate a holiday, releasing themselves playfully to the celebration. The other world is one of a mountain peak and is characterized by an invisible, transcendent God in the heights, by a code of moral laws engraved in stone tables, and, on the part of God as well as on the part of Moses, by a fierce wrath against the celebrating people. As I said, the two worlds collide, and this happens as follows. Moses, hot with anger, the word of God in his mind, and the tables of the law in his hands, breaks the latter in his wrath. Bursting as an outsider into the playful crowd, he grinds the image to powder. The sacred celebration is disrupted. To Aaron, who until now had guilelessly, without any evil thought, given himself over to the innocent enactment of the ritual, he gives a bad conscience, so that Aaron is now embarrassed and feels the need to justify himself. And finally, he forces everyone into a decision. Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come unto me. He commands his followers to take their swords and to go throughout the camp from gate to gate and to slay every man his brother and every man his companion and every man his neighbor. And there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. It tersely reads in our text. It always makes a crucial difference by which mythical images we are collectively informed. We have been brought up with this story. This image of a massacre executed upon the worshippers of the golden calf out of a zeal for the true God has been implanted into the soul of Western man for 2,000 years. It has grown deep roots there and has stamped traumatic fears upon us. We all live under the spell of this massacre. The shock goes deep. Ever since the call, "Who is on the Lord's side, let him come unto me," rang out, it time and again reverberates afresh in the depth of our being. And since then, an incurable rift goes through the people in our soul, infecting all our thoughts and experiences and molding them according to its image. If we follow the perspective of the narrator, then this is a story of the children of Israel's unfaithful falling away from their true God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt, and of their subsequent punishment. If, however, we look through the manifest content of the story to its latent content, we obtain an entirely different picture. The Old Testament scholarship informs us that the Hebrew word translated as calf is not actually intended to refer to a calf in this story, but is meant as a disparaging term for the image of a bull that in fact was the object of worship. Even more important is the insight gained by students of the history of religion that Yahweh himself originally had a bull nature, in accordance with all of ancient Semitic religion. This shows through even in later times, such as in formulations like Amos 1:2, "The Lord will roar." The tribal god of the Israelites, the God of trust, was, to be sure, a youthful God. But with him, the Israelites went back to the most ancient religious tradition of the Near East, which in other parts of this region had already become antiquated. They went back to the highest god of the ancient Semites, El Elyon, Genesis 14, the Lord of heaven and God of the world. This god is constantly apostrophized in the Ugaritic texts as Bull El. This means that the image of the bull worshipped by the children of Israel in our story and known to us under the name of golden calf was not a different alien god in opposition to the high God, but it was this very God himself. Looked at from this point of view, our story is not one of rebellion and of infidelity. This is just the author's interpretation of the events embedded in their account of them. What this tale actually is about is much rather a fateful event in the history of this God himself. It is a story of a change within God. God separates himself from an aspect of himself. God's nature splits apart in such a way that one part is split off. The celebrating people were thus by no means disloyal. On the contrary, they did what had up to now always been well-pleasing to God. But now they are surprised, even descended upon out of the blue, by this change in God, which for the first time progressive Moses seems to have envisioned. And as always, when there are changes in the divine sphere for which human consciousness is not prepared, they have to pay dearly. It is true that in the ancient Near East there do not seem to have been strictly theriomorphic gods, such as there were in Egypt. Rather, you typically find the connection of anthropomorphic gods with animals as their attendants. In pictorial representations from the ancient Near East, a deity in human shape is shown sitting on a throne while his feet rest on bulls. The bull is thus the pedestal of the Godhead. Also, there is a widespread cult continuing way into late antiquity, whereby the empty throne of the deity was put up in order to invite the deity, who in this case was considered essentially invisible, to come down. It might be possible to also understand along these lines what happened in the story of the golden calf. The image of the bull would then have been put up as a pedestal for the purpose of inviting the invisible God to come down and manifest himself. The animal as symbol or pedestal of an anthropomorphic or invisible deity already suggests an inner differentiation in the nature of God. The animal aspect, as pedestal, has become a literally lower aspect of this God. The bull has turned into a mere attendant who accompanies the God, even if he still remains his foundation. Whereas the God himself is obviously set off from the animal by way of his human shape, or even more so, as an essentially invisible God. He who once himself carried the title bull. But even this removed and raised deity nevertheless remained essentially connected to his animal. This was he himself in his visible aspect, and the bull image possessed the power to draw the invisible aspect down. However, what happens in our story is that God pushes off, as it were, from the bulls upon which his feet rest and takes off for the highest heights. And Moses' sword thus does not merely separate the people into two halves. It does not only slay those men remaining faithful to the calf, but it above all has the purpose of cutting the last threads binding God to his old shape as bull and of cleansing the idea of God from it. Thus, if we do not blindly take over the author's interpretation incorporated in their way of presenting the story, this is a tale of the birth of God as we know him, through a splitting of being as such. What is the notion of God resulting from the dissociation in God's nature? I mention a number of aspects which, however, are all interlinked. First, God casts off his visibility once and for all and becomes a totally invisible God. The real bull was at once also an epiphany of God. Even the invisible God of the ancient Near East was based, in the double sense of the word, on his visible pedestal. God needed a visible animal image in order to become present. For, to speak with Thomas Mann, how could you behold the God if not in the animal? Now there can be no epiphanies anymore. God is only present in faith and in the preaching of his word. Secondly, God ceases to be a world-immanent power and rises to the height of a completely supernatural, transcendent, extra-mundane God. Thirdly, this God grows into the absolute monotheistic God. As long as God was bull-shaped, there could not be just one God, as sure as there were, in addition to the bull, also sun, sea, lightning and thunder, etc. As a visible shape, he by necessity had to be particular, one God beside, or perhaps also above many others, but even if above them, then nevertheless only as primus inter pares. Fourth, along with the bull shape, God rejects his animal nature, or, psychologically speaking, his instinctual character, and defines himself from now on as spirit, pure spirit. Fifth, he loses his body and concrete reality and gradually turns more and more into an idea or ideal, namely into his own ego ideal or self-image. I say gradually, for only with the New Testament is the process of the thorough stylization of God's ego ideal as pure love completed and God totally identified with this ideal of himself. The place of epiphany, that is, of manifesting himself in earthly reality as he happens to be at each instance, is now taken by revelation, that is, the verbal statement about his nature. Because epiphany is no longer a possibility for God, he must require faith, belief in his statements. Epiphanies spoke for themselves. They were God's unreflected and uncensored self-representation through his actual behavior in the world. You did not have to, indeed you could not, believe in Neptune or Helios, because you had them in sea and sun before your eyes and were exposed to their workings. On the other hand, a self-commentary that is no longer confirmed in visible reality is dependent on belief and faith and requires a countless number of professing witnesses. As the sixth and last characteristic of the new notion of God that resulted from the splitting of God, I mention literalism. The original worship was directed to the image, the phenomenon, the phenomenal appearance, manifestation. The worshippers of the golden calf did by no means, we may presume, mistake for God the golden calf as object in the positivistic sense, because in a ritualistic culture, such an object did not yet exist. No, God was the visible sight of the golden luster and the powerful bull shape, the sight of the image shining forth from that which we today would call a dead object. And the worshippers of the golden calf did not, by way of mystification, believe in the image as if it were anything different from what it actually was. An image, nothing more. For everybody knew, of course, that it had just been cast from their own jewelry. But anybody who did not look utterly soullessly at the golden calf could immediately see from the image's radiating image nature that this is God. The essence of God was originally precisely in the radiation and in the luminosity inherent in this metaphoric shine. We must bear in mind the dialectics of this process of dissociation. Through the split in his nature, God rose above himself and ascended to previously unsuspected heights. He was able to acquire a literal existence. He turned into the pure and true God, the Absolute. But all this is not simply a gain, but also a loss. The rise to the Absolute is, as an absolvere, a detaching, at the same time a deprivation. God suffered a considerable loss in substance and is, as the infinite, only an infinitely diluted remainder of what he once was. Having exchanged the status of a phenomenal reality for the impoverished status of an assertion that is dependent on being believed in order to obtain a degree of reality and forcibleness. This is in complete contrast to the saturated and imperturbable existence that is the property of the mythical gods from the very beginning. In other words, God was only able to acquire his literal existence by paying the price of his substantiality, self-evidence, and worldly embodiment. Only by abandoning his visible image, only through his mystification, was he able to become absolute spirit and true God. Simultaneous with God's self-exaltation, visible reality was pushed to a lower level. It is one and the same action, Moses' sword stroke, that enthroned the true God and established idolatry for the first time. Moses' melting down and grinding to powder of the golden calf is an assault on the image nature of reality as such, an assault that receives its express theological foundation in the commandment, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness," which also belongs into the context of our tale. Moses reduces reality to mere matter, dust instead of divine image. Just as God becomes a literal God, so does matter in a positivistic sense originate here, if we extrapolate somewhat. It is this act which gives rise for the first time to the idea of something earthly that is nothing but earthly, for it is deprived of its imaginal shine. Its radiance, that is, God's Godhead, has systematically been extracted from it, as we have seen. It is crucial to see here that God's abandoning his visible bull figure did not mean that the bull was left alone and allowed to stay intact as he had been before. Rather, by the same degree that God rose to the heights, the image was tread down and destroyed. For God pushed off from it as from his pedestal, and by doing so pushed it down into the depths. This treading down, made evident in our story by Moses' grinding down of the calf, means that the same de-imagization that was God's lot also happened to the things of this earth. God's exodus from sensuous reality into absolute spiritualization on the one hand, and the destruction of the imaginal shape of things on the other, are mutual reflections of each other. To be sure, it took centuries until the divine image was completely ground to powder. Only with our present-day worldview has the program established in this story been redeemed and all of reality dismantled into dust. That is to say, into molecules, atoms, and subatomic elementary particles, to which, as to the ultimate and actual reality, all things having a visible shape can be, nay, must be, reduced. The complete description of what happened in our story runs as follows. First, God's rise into the heights of imageless spirit, transcendence. Second, the bulls, or more generally earthly realities, being pushed down into the non-imaginal state of mere matter, empirical positivity. And third, the elimination altogether of the imaginal from the prevailing ontology. What happened here is an enormity. It is the first nuclear fission, the nuclear fission, namely the splitting of the nucleus of being, the image. This first splitting was what made possible the nuclear explosions of modern physics. What we are dealing with here is not a matter only for students of religion. It is an ontological explosion upsetting the foundations of existence, of being as such. In correspondence with the nuclear explosions of physics, we can describe the three aspects of the first nuclear fission as follows. God's divine nature, which is the first component of the image as such, is raised to the heavens or even far beyond all heavens and becomes purely spiritual. It thus radiates with an unheard of intensity. This is what physicists call the star in nuclear explosions. The second component of the image as such, the earthly sensuous, is on account of the extracted divine aspect reduced to mere nature, namely to God's creation, which no longer is divine in its own right. This is what is called nuclear ash. Nuclear ash is not only a product of the nuclear explosions of the 20th century. Reality at large has at bottom been nuclear ash for more than 2 millennia. Only by being stripped of its inherent divinity did the world become accessible in its empirical nakedness, and was it gradually prepared for the scientific research and technical exploitation of a much later age. What the natural sciences focus on as their object of study is not primary nature. It has been from the very beginning nature reduced to its nuclear ash. The gold of the golden calf could never have been subjected to a chemical analysis. The bull could never have been used for biological experiments because the predicate God radiated forth from them. The release of the third of the two, the image nature, through the explosion apart of the image, released tremendous energy, just as do the nuclear fissions of physics. It was this released energy that first gave God the momentum for his takeoff into transcendence, that secondly supplied the world for the power with the power for its demonization and for the immense increase in realness that it experienced. We will return to this later. And that thirdly produced what we call in metaphysics as well as in psychology the will. The age-old story of the golden calf is thus, in the context of the history of our Christian West, also the myth of the birth of the will in the modern sense, of the birth of the modern ego whose innermost essence is the will. To what extent the will is now the character, the new character of being, ruling over everything that is, cannot be shown here in the necessary depth. I will confine myself to pointing out a few aspects of the subjugation of being under the will, and for the moment only with respect to the world and things. As long as being was immersed into the imaginal realm of the anima, the faces of the gods looked at man from within things. This means that things laid a claim on man. Things and situations demanded of themselves this or that treatment. They were binding, that is, as images, they directly affected, by virtue of their numinosity, the instinctual psyche, and thus led to that behavior that we call ritual. Ever since the decline of Epiphany and the exodus of the gods from this world into transcendence, the binding force has gone out of things and situations themselves. This force has been released and now has a separate existence in the shape of absolute ethical norms. To these, man has to bestow, by an act of will and by his own spiritual effort, any power and reality they may have, because they have no force of their own. The human ego and its moral attitude now carry the whole burden of responsibility, since the divine glance coming forth from reality no longer quite naturally leads to the soul's ritual activity at the instinctual level. The ethos of the ritualistic age was moored in external reality itself, not only man's actions, but the objective world was, so to speak, ethical in itself. In the case of moralistic ethics, however, man stands all alone with his moral responsibility vis-à-vis the world of things, which is now without obligation and subject to arbitrary decisions. Things have no will and claim of their own anymore, They are, as one says, ethically neutral. In that moment, when things are no longer the images of gods, but have their God as their extra-mundane creator outside of themselves, they have, in the last analysis, become fair game, mute objects of study and exploitation. For this reason, a moral law imposed from above becomes a necessity in order to restrain the use of the now outlawed reality. Thus, the story of God splitting himself off from the golden calf inevitably also had to be the story of the Ten Commandments, cut in stone tables, that is, the story of a change from the psychological and ritualistic relation to the world to a spiritual and moralistic one, and at the same time the story of the institution of man into his new mode as the willing one. The second component of the image, God, has also been immersed and subjected to the element of the ego will, just as was the case with earthly reality. God is now outside of the world so that he no longer speaks to the soul through visible epiphanies and no longer forces the overwhelming impression of his unquestionable reality upon it. God is nothing anymore by himself. He is now only an idea, completely subject to the accidentalities of man's faith, doubting, or indifference. Only indirectly, only through a spiritual act of man, faith, can God be supplied with that power that gives him a secondary reality. Faith is the volitional affirmation that man bestows upon God. And without this boost from man, God remains an empty word, as the history of the modern world proves. Our analysis of the dissociation of being in the sense of an ontological nuclear fission must be deepened. If God split off from his image as bull, then this has consequences for the categories of being as such. What is split here are, in the last analysis, the true and the real. The God resulting from the split is the true God. What is left of the bull after the split is, to be sure, visible and tangible, in other words, real. But it is only an idol, a false God. Thus we can also say that what is described here is the parting of God's truth and his reality. All of God's truth, that is God's godhood, or the predicate God, or also the pure idea of a God, is extracted from the God images and is isolated as a purified distillate of godhood. God thus turns into the ideal of a God which, however, lacks a convincing realness, since it was precisely his reality that was left behind. On the other hand, an earthly reality of God arises whose luminosity becomes more and more insistent, but is denied the predicate God, the recognition as divine. The word idol is the resulting compromise formation in Freud's sense. In the word idol, there lie both the acknowledgement of the real, numinous power that certain realities have over the soul, and at the same time the denial of the predicate God for this numinous impact that we feel. The enormity of what happened here may not have come home to us yet. Originally, truth and realness belonged together as a matter of course. The real was also the true, and the true only true to the extent that it was real. The situation in which truth and reality are the same, even though not alike, has the character of phanestai, appearance, shine. It is the situation of mythical or ritualistic reality. Most clearly, the essential oneness of the true and the real that we find in the mythical world is illustrated in a conversation between C.G. Jung and a chief of the Pueblo Indians. For the latter and his people, the sun was the divine father. Jung asked the chief whether he did not think that the sun was a ball of fire shaped by an invisible god. Jung, in other words, used the argument of Augustinus: God is not the sun, but he who made the sun. For the Indian, this was, Jung tells us, the most awful blasphemy. He merely answered, the sun is God. Everyone can see that. This is the Father. There is no Father behind it. What this Indian insisted on was that the numinous effect of the real phenomenon on the psyche be granted wholehearted and unreserved acknowledgement as God, without any curtailment or mitigation. There is nothing behind the phenomenon, and therefore also no mere external reality. What manifests itself and impresses the soul, including above all the primordial image of manifestation or shine itself, the sun, is true by virtue of its shining. And there is no other notion of truth here. For this reason, reality had to be binding and obligatory in itself. It bore in itself truth, that is, God's godhood, and thus the supreme soul value. Today, however, truth in philosophical or religious respects is a totally different matter from reality. That, for example, the nuclear bomb is real and deeply fascinates and frightens us, does not at all mean that it is something unquestionably true in the full sense of the word, and that it has full binding power over our attitude to it. On the contrary, we have to degrade it, along with everything truly numinous, into an idol, indeed into something diabolic. With the distinction between true and false gods, a fundamental confusion takes over. Ontological truth is confounded with logical truth, that is, the truth of our statements or predicates. Actual being and our recognition of this actuality as valid and binding are split apart. The recognition becomes something independent. Similarly, as with paper money, the value of things became a separate entity. It can now be granted to or withheld from any reality ad libitum. Actually, of course, there can be no false gods, for either they are gods, then they are not false, or they are something else, then they are not false either. The real is simply what it is, and in this does the unshakable truth of everything that exists lie. There is no true and false weather, are no true and false trees, but there are many kinds of weather and trees. The true God is about as meaningful as a statement like, only sunshine is true weather, rain is false weather. It is only our opinions and statements which can be false. With the words idol and false gods, however, one does not criticize a wrong opinion. Rather, a reality, the luminosity of the golden ball of the sun, of the thunderstorm, is being degraded. The energy released by way of the destruction of the image quality has become an instrument of power with which certain aspects of reality can arbitrarily be condemned while others are exalted. In other words, with which the world could be manipulated in a certain direction. As long as reality bore in itself the predicate truth, anything having a numinous effect on the soul was itself God or daimon. The actual effect was the only measure of truth. Now, however, the factual effect no longer counts. What and where God is determined by a pre-decided definition laid down in dogma. We now know a priori that certain things, even if they are highly real and numinous, cannot be God because they must not be God. In this way, we get a new formulation for the paradox mentioned earlier, that God, by having risen into the highest height of the absolute, has in truth submitted to an ideal or standard, and that conversely, he can be the true God only insofar as he subordinates himself to a norm. God now obeys a superego, as it were. He cannot simply be and appear as he is. He does not have free play for his nature, but must comply with a once and for all fixed standard, summum bonum, pure love. It is this what gives the new nature of God the character of an ego ideal. As long as visible reality bore the predicate God, it was securely moored in and bound by the name of God. On account of its divine nature, the mythical world bore a pleromatic fullness and gravity in itself, which prevented things from striving beyond themselves into boundlessness. This changed in that moment when reality was cut off from its inner mooring in the middle ground of the imaginal by a blow of the sword. From then on, things did not have their ontological center of gravity in themselves. That center had been transferred from within into an ontological state of inevitable unrest. That center had been transferred from within them into transcendence, so that things of this world were brought into an ontological state of inevitable unrest, since they now had to yearn for their center in a ceaseless striving. Since then, to use formulations by Nietzsche, the world is rolling from its center into the X, similar to a stream that wants to go to its end, a process that began almost imperceptibly and became noticeable for everyone only during the modern age. Just as God's truth, cut off from his reality, had striven for the highest heights like a released balloon, so conversely reality, separated from the name of God and thus unleashed, could and had to strive to advance its earthly realness to unheard degrees of intensity in order to correspond to the intensification reached by the predicate God. The tremendous amount of energy released by its separation from God's truth was now available for its completely autonomous development. The whole strength formerly invested in the ritual binding of reality, and thus in reality's trueness, was now for the sole benefit of reality pure and simple. This means reality was charged enormously. It was demonized. Reality, too, was supposed to acquire a literal existence instead of an imaginal one. The latest result to date of this development is the nuclear bomb. With it, a degree of reality has been reached, behind which the wildness and danger of the bull and of all other former god animals, including Leviathan and Behemoth, fade to nothing. Natural reality has intensified into technical reality. God's animal shape, tied into the entire complex of life, has been surpassed by the abstract and absolutely unleashed machine shape of God. Just as God's truth underwent, with the God of pure love, a stylization into the absolute ideal, cleansed from all reality, so also reality, released from its bondage to God's truth, intensified into the sheer essence or distillate of realness. Nuclear energy is, as it were, realness as such, realness absolute, cleansed from all the cinders of the ideal that by necessity were originally incorporated in the real. With this situation, however, development is reversed. The nuclear bomb is so frighteningly real that it simply forces consciousness to recognize it as an undeniable truth, in one way or another. With it, the long degraded and repressed reality has caught up again with that consciousness that had been exclusively fixated on pure truth. In the shape of the bomb, God's repudiated reality demands from us repayment with interest of a gigantic debt. Demands, namely, the name of God which was withheld from it for more than 2 millennia. The unreserved recognition of it as true God. Western mankind owes reality worship, having disparaged it as an idol, false gods, mammon, Moloch, kingdom of Satan, the secular, and the like. Western man has praised God's truth or idea to the skies, indeed so highly that in the end it evaporated. But he disowned reality like a bastard, even though this reality attracted with tremendous power man's greed, consumer goods, his curiosity, science, and his industry, big business, and thereby proved its irresistible luminosity. Through faith, by believing, mankind sold itself to God's truth, abandoned itself blindly to God's self-image or ego ideal. Even if Western man owes God's reality a debt because of having blindly believed in God's image as love, we must not forget that it was God himself who cut himself off from his reality and commanded that it be disparaged. With his zeal, God himself pursued his upward stylization to the absolutely true God and demanded faith in this image of himself. But, as the psychotherapist would owe something to his patient if he were to blindly believe the latter's self-representation instead of also perceiving his unconscious reality, so God too has been betrayed in a deeper sense precisely because mankind believed his self-representation and complied with the degrading of God's reality pursued by God himself. It would seem to have been man's task to be more perspicacious and to try the spirits with critical alertness. What in the shape of the nuclear bomb is knocking at our door and wants to be received into consciousness is nothing else but God's own reality. That reality that he had centuries ago cast away in the form of the bull image, and that since that unleashing has now revealed itself at long last as the nuclear explosive power. Therapeutically, it is an indispensable necessity that the unleashed be bound again, that what has been split off be united with its other half. It must not be said again, "He came unto his own, and his own received him not." But the binding of the unleashed cannot take place in technology or by political techniques alone. Rather, it must also, even primarily, take place psychologically, and here again not only personalistically, but on the objective level of the psyche, that is, in our ontology and theology. God's reality must finally be given back its truth, withheld from it for so long. And for that reason, I say, the nuclear bomb is God. It is not I who deifies the nuclear bomb. Objective phenomenology has long done so. In view of the bomb, must we not, to quote Schleiermacher, have the feeling of our absolute dependence? Is the nuclear bomb, not to speak with Tillich, our ultimate concern? In its face, must we not confess, to use Luther's phrase, did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing? Is it not, to cite Rudolf Otto, the numinous power of our age? It is the supreme ruler over our existence or non-existence. It has the power to drive hundreds of thousands of people to public demonstrations, a modern variety of sacred processions. It causes boundless fears, shows itself to man in countless dreams, and above all, according to its telos, it is all-permeating radiation, blazing heat, burning fire, all-crushing pressure wave. This is what we actually experience. Now it is a question of whether we deny this experience after the event and give it a different interpretation on the basis of some prejudices, or whether we recognize it as binding for our thinking and speaking. Do we acknowledge what we experience? Do we allow our experience to tell us what name to give to it? Or will we be blind to it, and do we situate our thinking and speaking in a cut-off realm of consciousness? If our real experience binds our thinking and speaking, then we must say the nuclear bomb is God, our true God, the God of the Christian West in his reality. That something as dreadful as the nuclear bomb is supposed to be God is nothing strange as far as the history and phenomenology of religion is concerned. Even the Christian God was dreadful at the times of the Old Testament. Of course, this is in sharpest contrast to his self-revelation as love. But maybe we can apply to our topic a differentiation that Kafka used in some other connection, and say, on the basis of our actual phenomenological experience, yes, truly, God is love, but still more truly is he the terror of being, or, as Jung once formulated it, the almighty shadow, the fear that fills heaven and earth. Yes, indeed, God is his truth, but still more truly is he his reality. Truly, still more truly, this is the relationship that prevails between consciousness and the unconscious, between self-image and reality. The statement, the nuclear bomb is God, cannot be taken literally. It would be absurd. Rather, this statement explodes our customary literal notion of God as well as our literal understanding of the bomb as a merely technical object. I cannot believe in the bomb as God, for then I would have idolized it. But neither can I look for God behind it, behind reality, and attribute a literal existence above the world to him. Let us keep in mind what the Pueblo Indian said. The Son is God. Everyone can see that. He is the Father. There is no Father behind him. This worshipped Son is, of course, not the reduced Son of physics or astronomy. It is the full-fledged original Son, that is to say, the image that looks at the soul from within the Sun's depth. In the same vein, the nuclear bomb is not God as an object of physics, but as the real image of the absolute terror that it throws into the soul and that fills the soul with fear and awe. Or it is the image of that inconceivable radiance before which we could not hide our face anymore, but would have to retreat to fallout shelters. Here, we do not have to mystify. Everyone can see that if his heart is not obdurate. We don't have to look for anything behind the phenomenon. The real, unreduced side of the nuclear bomb is God. Literalism, that is, the metaphysical relation to being, has thus been overcome, and being is grounded again in the metaphorical image, in appearance, in the phenomenal shine. We, for our part, return with this metaphorical, psychological, phenomenological position into a new primitivity, if you wish, into a kind of animism, which, as you know, comes from anima. As Jung once stated in a conversation with a man of the church, I am a primitive. You are a civilized man. When Jung reported this conversation, he added, in a way, this man is much more wonderful than I am. He can, on account of the means of grace of the church, be a saint. I cannot be a saint. I can only be a nigger, very primitive, going by the next thing, quite superstitious. If we go by the next best in this quite naive way, then we will, I assume, go down on our knees in view of the dreadful terror and the unspeakable radiance looking at us from within the nuclear bomb. Then the worship of the golden calf, interrupted at that time, could be concluded, but on the completely new level of the absolute that we have meanwhile arrived at. Does not God's reality, does not his dreadfulness, does not the nuclear bomb demand of us that we worship it? Is worship not the only real possibility of its propitiation? With worship, I of course do not mean to approve of it, to be for it. I simply mean that we correspond to the actual experience in our soul by a conscious recognition of the substance of this experience. I mean, figuratively speaking, the dance around our golden calf. Can you imagine this? A mankind that dances around the bomb? A mankind whose hardening and contentiousness, whose power competition and protesting would be softened in the dance? A mankind that would swing into the atomic music of being? And a bomb that would not have to be used anymore because it would be the center authorizing the dance? A bomb which as that center would bind man, and by binding us would also be itself bound? Thank you. There will be a break of about 10 minutes.